or important you are or educated you are. Asingeni lokho thina.
But Shivambu said he will not beg to be a member.
If MK thinks that listening is a cause for termination of membership, so be it. It's not the first time. Like my membership of the ANC, I was not even expelled in the ANC, I was suspended. And I left. This thing of political parties thinking that people are desperate for their membership must come to an end. And that people must beg for membership. I left the ANC voluntarily when it had power. Why would I be perturbed about being expelled by Mkondo who doesn't have power?
Unscrupulous people that he refused to name are influencing the elderly former statesman and are stealing money from South Africa's third largest party.
The president of Mkondo, whom I dearly and so deeply respect, is surrounded by political scoundrels who opportunistically use his kindness, sometimes gullibility that comes with age, to write down fake intelligence report, influence him towards wrong directions. And the reason they do that is because they want to steal money from Mkondo Sizwe. And they are doing so now. Withdrawal of not less than 7 million rand every month from the organizational coffers. That is what defined, and that is what, and we're talking about this because we raised it internally that stop what you are doing, because you're going to get the party deregistered as a political party.
Shivambu was only with the party for 10 months. During that time, he was appointed as Secretary General in November 2024. Despite his announcement, he remains a disciplined member of the party, he says. Taking from Zuma's hymn sheet, Zuma also announced his leadership of the MK party while being a member of the African National Congress. During Floyd Shivambu's tenure, there were allegations he attempted to centralize financial control of the party and have sole authority over its funds. Addressing the media on Thursday, he threw shade at his former political party led by Julius Malema, the Economic Freedom Fighters, calling it a cult. For Channel Africa News, I'm Dimakazo Leshoro in Johannesburg.
12 minutes past 9. Let's continue with the program now. We talk about as the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda prepare to formalize a US-backed Qatar-backed peace agreement later this month. Questions remain about whether this deal can finally bring about an end to the long-running conflict in eastern Congo. With over 7.8 million people displaced and the M23 rebel group tightening its grip on strategic areas, the stakes couldn't be higher. To unpack what the agreement really means and whether it stands a chance of lasting, we're joined now by the Great Lakes region political analyst Didier Bayeye. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Mr. Bayeye.
Good evening, Tsepiso. Good evening to the listeners.
Perhaps let's just recap on the salient points of the agreement as they stand and where the stumbling blocks are.
Okay, at this stage, and according to the reports that has reached us, everything seems to move smoothly, even though this agreement is being drafted in the and under the leadership of the United States government and authorities, but both parties, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda authorities, are part of it. So the content of this agreement is done in mutual agreement with both belligerents, with both parties. So we're really not expecting any stumbling block at this stage.
And you're saying both belligerents, but of course, practically we mean a number of splinter groups and I would say a very ripe situation for discord, whether it emerges immediately or in the long run. So do you believe that all relevant parties who would influence the sustainability of peace have been included?
Not really. Right now, I think the main focus is with the main belligerent. We're talking about M23 rebels backed by Rwandan army. This is the reason why we see Rwanda more involved than any other country or any other representative. If you look at how this is unfolding, then you can also notice that we're not talking, in the US and the Doha agreement or the peace talk, there is no representation of the M23, but there is the representation of Rwanda. So, which tells us that it's becoming evident that Rwanda is operating behind other rebel groups such as M23 and AFC that saw days just few months before the end of last year. So the remaining groups are really minor groups that the DRC government believe will not be an issue to deal with them. So,
and the reason I asked that, allow me to ask this,
Yeah.
Didier, because I mean, one of the reasons we know Rwanda has said it has often objected or spoken about territorial integrity as a reason for being involved in one way or the other to what it agrees to. And when Qatar speaks about complementarity and alignment on this deal, it may be well and good that there is a greater alignment between M23 and Rwanda on the reasons why it is present in the DRC and what it sees as its right to claim, what it sees as theirs. But what happens then when the major figures within this alignment of M23 and Rwanda then hit a snag on, even if it's minor things? Does that not have the potential of rocking the whole deal?
No, I doubt at this stage anything like that, anything else can happen to rock the whole deal. If we have to say it in a different words, we will say that Rwanda is the power of M23. And then we also remember the DRC president says that he wants to talk, he wants to negotiate, he wants peace, but he doesn't want to talk to the puppets. He wants to talk to the main guy. He wants to talk to the leader. And he was pointing Rwandan government. He was pointing at Rwanda president Paul Kagame, because all the evidence has proven that it is Rwanda. Without Rwanda backing these rebel groups, there is no existence of the rebel group. And this is just in the beginning, this was not understood. But when we look at the process, how it's going, starting with the Rwanda process, treaty, the Nairobi, the Doha, and now the US, it's Rwanda with the DRC sitting around the table. So clearly, these are the two main actors to bring peace in the region. And if Rwanda is talking of territorial integrity, then I guess in the first place, they should start by respecting the international territorial integrity as it is convened by the UN treaty, as is convened by the EU treaties, and many more. So they first need to start there. That is why when we look at the components of this agreement, this draft agreement, first of all, even though it focuses on the political security and economic interest, there is a provision. It also cater, or there is a provision I wanted to say for security, for integration of non-state armed groups, but also for the return of refugees and displaced, internally displaced people. So, when this is all done and put in place, then there shouldn't be any reason for conflict to continue. The only way this conflict will continue is if any of these two parties the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda refuses to sign this agreement.
Didier, let me ask this
draft,
question, and at risk of being called naive here. If amnesty is being spoken about, and let's go to that issue of territorial integrity, and if the complaints are what the Berlin conference achieved was almost King Solomon cutting the baby in half, which Rwanda has always maintained that its people have been forced to be in the DRC, and that's what it's fighting for. So amnesty, it means that there must be a questions to the wrongs that have been done. So are we seeing a process where both parties are admitting to wrongdoing and compensation?
Yes. Compensation has to be done. Amnesty doesn't mean not to hold the people accountable. There are hundreds of thousands of lives that have been lost in the eastern part of the DRC. Recently, just with the seizure of the town of Goma, the UN report has it more than 10,000 civilians were killed. So at some point, people need to be held accountable. And amnesty doesn't mean getting away with the wrongdoing. I really doubt that is what amnesty is all about. But right now, the process has it that, first of all, to get peace on the way, to get the armed group either integrated in the society, not even in government institutions, because one of the reasons that we having such situation in the DRC is because in the past, some of the rebels have been integrated in the army in government position. So they always felt like entitled and that they have to carry guns and continue with such behavior. So these people, or those who are orchestrating such atrocities, need to be taken to task, need to face the might of the law as it's supposed to be. Amnesty doesn't mean that killing thousands of people and walking away as a free man. I really believe that the process is followed or put in place by the US is the correct one, and is done in partnership with both Rwanda and the DRC. So if they've agreed to the agreement draft, then nobody should backslide. And
all right, Didier, we're going to have to leave it there.
From signing the contract, this agreement.
All right, thank you, Didier. We have run out of time. Much appreciated. Didier Bayeye is a Great Lakes region political analyst, speaking to us about the final countdown to Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo formalizing the US-backed, Qatar-backed peace deal. Brings the time to 23 minutes past 9.
Africa in Business on Channel Africa.
The president of the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, Badea, Dr. Sidi Ould Tah, is vying for the presidency of the African Development Bank, the AFDB. He positions himself as a fervent defender of economic integration and structural transformation on the African continent.
Well, I do believe that I have a 360 view of the development challenges in the continent with my experience from both the supply side and the demand side. But more importantly, my vision is to bring on board all the stakeholders and to have a holistic approach for the development of the continent and to develop partnership across the continent and outside the continent, bringing all the stakeholders together to work for one goal is to make Africa green for life and livelihood of the African population.
Bringing the African markets into your home. Channel Africa, the African perspective. At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Sipiso Makwetla.
Channel Africa.
24 minutes past 9 from resolving the decades-long Democratic Republic of Congo conflict to What we look at, related in a way, today being World Day of the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, a moment to confront the devastating use of rape as a weapon of war and stand with survivors who are too often silenced by stigma and injustice. Joining us now is Dr. Avni Amin from the World Health Organization, a global expert on violence against women in crisis settings, and she is also the head of the Sexual Violence Unit there. So she joins us to talk about what is needed to not only hold perpetrators to account, but also tell us what can be done to help survivors. Dr. Avni, a very good evening to you, and I really appreciate the time that you've taken to speak to us.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be online.
So let's just first start with what is the status quo? So if we say sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war, and it almost seems as if society, we have accepted that it's part and parcel, par for the course for conflict around the world. But are perpetrators being held to book, and is it possible to hold them accountable?
So let me start by just saying that sexual violence in conflict is not inevitable. There are settings and countries where it has been used deliberately to terrorize civilians. And there are conflicts where sexual violence is not used as a weapon of war. It does increase, but it's not a deliberate, intentional targeting of women and girls in some countries.
Mm-hmm.
So what that should give you is hope that, there are ways to not let sexual violence be used as a tactic of war. And that's a choice that warring parties make in certain settings. And other settings and commanders, military commanders, don't make that choice.
What is the distinction? What is the distinction in cases where it is used as a weapon of war and where there is a choice, as you say, which almost sounds discordant with such a heinous, and well, that is a fact that it is a choice. But in cases where it's not, what is the distinction? What stops it happening?
Well, there is some evidence that military commanders who deliberately instruct their soldiers to do it, and then there are military commanders in settings who will actually say this is not acceptable. So that's a choice that military commanders can make and say this is not acceptable, or they can say go ahead and do it because that's the way to humiliate and terrorize the opposition, right? So that's one thing I think one has to realize, that there are people who use it as a form of humiliation, terrorizing, diluting the opposition, and then there are people who will say, okay, this is a war, this is a conflict, but we do not need to target civilians and women and children in this way. So that's a big distinction, and I think that speaks to the fact that it's not inevitable and that one can prevent it. The second thing I wanted to talk about is impunity and accountability. Now, at the moment, the mechanisms we have to end impunity are twofold. One is at the global and international level. You have International Court of Justice and you have international criminal tribunals that have been held for war crimes related to sexual violence in the past, namely in the case of Rwanda and in the case of Bosnia. Which should tell you that it is possible to, and it's being recognized as a war crime, and it's possible to hold perpetrators accountable. At the national level, you do need to have stronger justice systems that actually hold at the national level hold perpetrators accountable. And unfortunately, rape is one of those crimes where wartime or not, justice is not always served to most victims. The rate of basically holding the perpetrators accountable from the time it's reported to the time it goes to the court, and then the perpetrators held or convicted is so there's a huge drop, and it speaks to a system failure. It speaks to the fact that first, women are too afraid, and many times the perpetrators are roaming around free. People know them if they are in a position of power. if it's a minister or somebody high up with the, in the military, they're roaming around, and it scares women to come forward and report.
And that's what I'm thinking, that if it scares them from coming forward, then how do you, as the UN, through, as an agency and your various partnerships, then deal with the GBV as a health and humanitarian emergency if people don't report it, because it has various manifestations?
Yeah. So there are a couple of partnerships that I just wanted to bring into the picture and highlight these, because they have actually been established to, generate advocacy and generate attention to the issue of conflict-related sexual violence. The first is the UN Action, which is an inter-UN agency initiative that is there to specifically bring attention to the problem of conflict-related sexual violence. The representative of the Secretary General for this is currently Pramila Patten, and she uses that platform to really raise attention to countries and settings where this is happening. The second is the Prevention of Sexual Violence initiative in conflict settings that the UK government has for some time now been running. And that is another mechanism to raise attention to the issue of conflict-related sexual violence. And they usually have at least once every year or once every other year conferences to really raise awareness and identify mechanisms to bring justice and health and support, psychosocial support to survivors. So there are partnerships that are recognizing this and drawing attention to it, and advocating to bring accountability to perpetrators. Then there are the things that humanitarian workers and humanitarian actors can do as part of humanitarian aid. And here it is making sure that humanitarian response actors are, from a response perspective, a health response perspective, that they are trained to provide empathetic care, to provide medical support and psychosocial support to survivors in an empathetic way. And that includes as part of health services. And I can give you some concrete examples of where this has happened. Then there is obviously other things like protection, where, making sure that when women are living in refugee camps, that access to water and sanitation is safe, that there's lighting in the refugee settings that is safe, so that women can walk without fear. There are other ways in which women can get protection living in a refugee setting or a context where the risk of gender-based violence, sexual violence can be mitigated. So there are all of these things that are being put in place, but I think it is not necessarily enough, I would say, and it is not commensurate to the scale of the problem.
So I want to talk about, country context, but also I'd imagine regional context, but also the era in which we're living in now. When this was adopted 7 years ago, there would have been changes not only from a policy perspective, but if we look at the fact that we are seeing increasingly climate change, conflict, and gender-based violence collide, what has changed, and what is the global architecture being able to do to confront this?
So several things. One is that climate change has made the frequency of emergencies much more. There are more humanitarian emergencies and more people living in humanitarian emergencies than ever before, and that's something we have to grapple with. Climate change is also contributing to countries then having conflicts, and there are more conflicts than perhaps what we might have seen earlier. So I think we are grappling with that. And then the other thing that is happening is that a lot of these emergencies are what you call protracted, right? So if you take countries like Mali, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, you have a drought, you have conflict, you have other types of insecurities, and stretched health systems. You might have pandemics happening, epidemic outbreaks happening at the same time. And so everything is converging and really, really stretching the systems. And in a way, a lot of these factors are coming together in a way that is increasing the risks and exposure to gender-based violence, not only because populations are on the move, women and children are left behind, they may not have shelter, they may be without family members' protection. There is more stress and economic uncertainty in the house. Food insecurity and scarcity leads women to have to perhaps bargain or exchange sex for food. So all of this puts them at much higher risks of gender-based violence because you have a confluence of these factors.
Dr. Amin, it's such a pity we've run out of time, but I do appreciate your time in speaking to us about this very important matter. Today being World Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence and Conflict. Dr. Avni Amin from the World Health Organization is the head for the rights and equality throughout the life course team and leads the WHO's work on violence against women. Brings the time to 24 minutes to 10.
Mornings made better with Peter and Asanda on Rise and Shine, weekdays 6 till 9.
In recent weeks, East Africa has seen a disturbing rise in human rights violations. In Kenya, digital activist Rose Njeri was arrested under the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act after creating a tool for citizens to oppose the Finance Bill 2025. Meanwhile, in Tanzania, Kenyan activist Boniface Mwangi and Ugandan lawyer Agatha Atuhaire reported being detained, tortured, and sexually assaulted by security officers.
East Africa needs a reset. We need to get back East Africa to where the founding fathers are. When President Nyerere and his colleagues Jomo Kenyatta and the Ugandan counterparts fought for independence, they fought for independence to get Africans out of poverty, to get Africans out of slavery. The leaders who took up power have since gotten into regression.
Neto Agostino, co-leader of the United Green Movement Party.
Mornings made better with Peter and Asanda on Rise and Shine. At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Sepiso Makweta.
Channel Africa.
23 minutes to 10, as we say here on Africa World, our 60 minutes, one world, countless stories, and that we bring you the voices, the stories and the perspectives that matter. So we talk about something that has been part of the public discourse for years here in South Africa, and of course raising lots of debate. The issue of state capture. It remains one of the most pressing threats to democratic governance globally. This week, the New South Institute, in partnership with local and international institutions, are hosting a series of events exploring how countries can rebuild public institutions from systemic corruption. After among the featured voices is a leading global expert who going to develop the very concept of a state capture and has advised governments and institutions worldwide on how governance and accountability can be inculcated. We're joined now by economist and governance specialist Daniel Kaufman, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and Results for Development, and co-founder and president emeritus of the Natural Resource Governance Institute. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Piso.
I want to start
My pleasure.
I want to start with, I know when we were wrapping our heads around state capture in South Africa, and I know myself personally, I just didn't realize how much material and how much literature there was on state capture. And I thought, if there's so many academic works on it, how do governments find themselves in a situation where it's so pernicious? And it just seems like it's almost easy. Mr. Kaufman, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Please.
Yes. So
yes.
I was asking, how what is the state of it? I mean, how is it that there's been so much literature about what state capture is, the various forms that it takes, but yet it seems like it continues to grow like a cancer, almost left to its own means. How is that the case?
Yeah, well, the fact that it continues to grow is because state capture is intimately linked to acute inequality of influence and power, and in around the world that has been a trend. So one thing that we did with Joel Hellman when we coined the notion of state captures over 30 years ago is to distinguish it very clearly from the traditional talk about corruption, which still is around. So if I'm a particular businessman that really wants to get a liquor license, for instance, in a neighborhood that hasn't allowed to do so, then I try my way around by providing a bribe to a mid-level public official. I do that, or for a contract with a government agency, one transaction, and so on. But if you imagine that there is a powerful, very powerful financier, private, very well connected to high-level politicians and leaders, and he, usually it's a he, but can be a she, conspire to get control of a state-owned enterprise or chunks of the public expenditure, or rigging the public procurement system to ensure that many big construction contracts come to them. That is state capture, and it's much more lucrative. It's much more systemic. The first case that I just mentioned, which is traditional corruption, is basically a one-time transaction, a transactional bribe, as a way of getting around the regulations, the rules of the game that have existed in the state. But the second case, when we talk about state capture, we're talking about shaping and distorting the rules of the game by the powerful, shaping, distorting the institutions and the process to benefit those few in the elite. So it's a much higher level, much more systemic, affecting all the rules of the game, and very, very lucrative. So many have understood, unfortunately, and some leaders on both the private and state sector, that this can be basically much more systemic and lucrative than the typical traditional corruption transaction of the past.
What would be then the difference if we're talking about the unequal balance of power between state capture and elite capture?
The main difference is that by focusing on state capture, we focus first on who is the captor. And just by saying the elite, that's insufficient, because it could be a very powerful private, but increasingly we have found, and that has been the experience in many countries, that the state leader can play a key role, or other high-level politicians, or the collusion between both. So it forces us to think through in a more profound way as to who is the captor. But not only that, elite capture doesn't say much as to the objects of capture, what is being captured. By spelling it out as state capture is basically the institutions, the policies, the regulations, and the laws of the state, the rules of the game which are being captured, which by saying elite capture, that leaves it very vague. So we try to be much more specific about the captors and about the objects of capture, which produces the immense damage that state capture can produce.
I'm just thinking back to a report that was looking at the forms, the causes of illicit financial flows that was released years ago by former President Thabo Mbeki. And he spoke very extensively about the corrupt and the corruptee, but when we, at least in certain circles, speak about state capture, here in South Africa, for instance, there's a lot of concentration on the public bureaucracies. But what about corporatism? And has that evolved over the years?
First of all, the corporate, but the very powerful corporates. It's not. We have to be very careful here because most of the private sector in most of the democratic countries, or even semi-democratic countries, they play a very productive role, and they essentially want to compete fairly to thrive. The problem is with some very, very specific and powerful and influential ones that believe, and not so wrongly, that maybe they can make more of a financial killing by exerting their unequal influence and capturing the rules of the game. So there are segments of the corporate sector, segments of the private sector they have played a very important role. Now, depending on the country and over time, this has evolved basically in terms of both the types of captors, from the oligarchs of the past, especially in Russia and for a while in Ukraine, but not any longer in the same way, played a very important role. But there are other very important captors that we need to pay much more attention these days, like organized crime, for instance, are very important. In some countries, political parties play a very important role in the capturing, and as I said, also state leaders in some countries. Well, the case of Russia is an extreme case, but there are others too.
I'm glad you speak about organized crime, because we have seen in the past couple of years where various aspects of organized crimes have been sanitized. I'll take an example. And there have been reports through investigative journalists and journalism that suggests, if you look at high level events such as the WEF, where it said that a group of men who hold a great deal of the globe's financial weight would take a plane full of young children to said event, and of course various sexual events occur. But I'm pointing to human trafficking here, where some of these things have been sanitized. And the question I'm asking is that, is it possible that some of these things have been sanitized to such an extent that they have been culturalized to be acceptable, while they actually mirror what organized criminals do?
It is certainly possible, and unfortunately. And part of the problem is in which world we live now, where the narratives and the cognitive aspect of capture play such a role, which is not always exposing the real truth and the real facts, as we all well know. The other problem is our fault too, both in the academic think tanks, but perhaps also in the media. And that's why I welcome very much your questions of what are we talking about when we talk about state capture and other things. We need to make it very clear that this has an impact, an enormous impact, not just the economic, social, but the quality of life of people, on the electricity of the country, but on the aspects that you are also mentioning, and put the human cost very, very clearly. And we haven't done a very effective job on that. So the issue of the narrative is a clear challenge ahead. Now, if I can quickly comment, because you mentioned organized crime, and you did mention also that we had a session with the NSI yesterday and other partners and great experts from South Africa. I was the only outsider, including Paul Pretorius, who led the investigation and the prosecutorial side of the Zondo Commission. And one issue that did come up is, in fact, while recognizing the progress that South Africa has made in averting fuller state capture, and that's why the Zondo Commission always played a key role, it was also mentioned that there is increasing concern about these other actors like organized crime. So there was a very interesting discussion where there was recognition about the progress and the direction of travel of South Africa, which did not continue increasing in terms of state capture, as opposed to what's happening, for instance, in the United States and other countries. But there is that concern that you mentioned. We did not discuss the issue of human trafficking, however.
So just to conclude, what role can civil society play in anti-corruption work, but also what role is technology, emerging technologies particularly, playing in the increase of state capture?
First, the role of civil society is crucial, and it varies from country to country. In some countries, more effective and more active, and also with a better ability to operate more freely. That's one of the strengths, frankly, about the case of South Africa. They played an absolutely key role with think tanks and so on, the exposure of state capture and bringing it to light and in the investigations. So it's absolutely crucial, and perhaps the most crucial. We should not underestimate also the role of other actors in addressing state capture. The judges play a key role, the courts, not only at the highest level, but mid-level courts and so on. And we see it happening in other countries. Now, technology can cut both ways, but I would like to mention that technology, and especially now with AI tools and so on, and by essentially automatizing it and putting it all in technology, many of these processes and so on, and ring-fencing it from the human side of capture can be very effective and can be very positive. And some ministries in South Africa and taking the lead on that in terms of the whole issue about visas and so on. But while at the same time, we know that organized crime and other very bad actors can use technology, and including AI and crypto and so on, for nefarious purposes. So it can cut that way too, and that we need to stay ahead of the game.
It's an ongoing battle.
It's a race. It's a race.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it and sharing your insights and your knowledge. Daniel Kaufman, Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution and Results for Development, co-founder and President Emeritus of the Natural Resource Governance Institute. He, as you said, one of the people who formulated the very concept of state capture. It's 8 minutes to 10.
Je, una jambo lolote akilini mwako? Je, una shauku kuhusu masuala muhimu? Na je, una maoni ambayo unataka yasikike? Kweli, hili jukwaa ni la kwako. Piga simu au tuandikie kwenda WhatsApp namba alama ya kujumulisha 2760552594 na tutakupigia simu.
Mtangazaji wa habari zetu za Afrika Kusini mjini Johannesburg.
Hivyo unaweza kuwa mshirika kwenye matangazo yetu. Sio mazungumzo tu, ni fursa yako ya kuchangia maoni yako na kushirikiana na jumuiya ya wasikilizaji wanaotamani mtazamo wako. Tufuate kwenye mitandao ya kijamii. Tembelea tovuti yetu www.channelafrica.co.za na uwe tayari kushiriki na kuchangia maoni yako kwenye Channel Africa. Channel Africa, mtazamo wa Kiafrika. Darubini ya Afrika na I am Henry Shakif.
Hawa wa Afrika Kusini wenye asili ya kizungu ambao wamepewa ukimbizi huko nchini Marekani. Je, nini chanzo cha wao kuomba ukimbizi nchini Marekani?
Wenyewe hawajaomba ukimbizi. Kuna shirika fulani inaitwa AfriForum, shirika mbili za wazungu ambao wanatetea haki ya wazungu hapa, AfriForum na Solidarity. Hao walienda Marekani kufanya kampeni kusema kwamba wazungu wananyanyaswa hapa Afrika Kusini, na walivyofanya hiyo kampeni, serikali iweze kuwafuatilia kujua nini ambacho mnasema kwamba mnanyanyaswa.
Kuna namna ya wao kwamba wamepoteza uraia wa Afrika Kusini, na je, endapo Trump akamaliza muda wake madarakani, uhalali wao wa kuishi nchini Marekani ukoje?
Itakuwa vigumu, kifupi itakuwa vigumu wenyewe kupoteza uraia wao.
Darubini ya Afrika 11 kamili hadi 12 kamili majira ya Afrika ya Kati.
At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Sipiso Makwetla.
Channel Africa.
It's been a busy program. Let's wrap it up with some interesting perspective. And this is South Africa's crime crisis, again making international headlines, but not necessarily for the right reasons. So in recent weeks, as you've seen, US President Donald Trump reigniting a long-standing controversy by claiming that white South African farmers are victims of genocide and sparking global outrage and fresher debate on whether or not this is a deliberate campaign of misinformation. So we're going to look at how we can sometimes make the figures bear when we talk about this political rhetoric and whether or not we can scientifically prove it. We're speaking now with someone who's been on the ground witnessing how crime really unfolds and who's part of a tech-driven solution aimed at tackling the response gap. Justin Sutton is General Manager of Aura Sub-Saharan Africa, leading voice in community safety. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Justin. We have run out of time, so I'm going to try and get as much as possible. So when a lot of voices have been said, but this is untrue, you know it's untrue. President Donald Trump throwing papers and saying, we've got proof. How does a company like yours disprove these lies?
Yes, thanks for having me on the show. Look, I think a company like ours, because we, in essence, are democratizing access to safety and security through varying different initiatives and our business model, what we see is a huge amount of data coming in from all walks and all demographics of the South African population. And we actually see that our data shows us that's painting quite a grim picture of crime in South Africa. And our platform gives us a very, very big insight that, and obviously getting to the response part of it, but ultimately understanding what the general citizen of the country is facing on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis.
And we know that it affects everybody in this country, that it has no preference. So how does a jaundiced perspective like this impact on genuine crime prevention efforts in South Africa?
Yeah, so, in terms of the...
Hi, Justin, do we still have you on the line?
We're back. Sorry about that. In terms of crime prevention in South Africa, I think there's a big misconception that you are powerless to do something. So one, obviously, Aura, is helping everyone in the country, by enabling them access to private response services. But ultimately, there's a lot of initiatives and a lot of just, I'd say, accountability that the average person needs to take for themselves, whether it's being aware of your surroundings, whether it's understanding, when you're at risk, where you're at risk, how you can be at risk. And ultimately, we sometimes see quite a bit of an apathetic attitude of people in South Africa. However, having said that, we still believe that there's hope, and that technology like ours and a network like ours is ultimately there to prevent and tackle these broader issues, specifically when it comes to crime.
Okay, so then give me an example. Where do you fit in when we talk about critical bottlenecks in terms of traditional service spaces? And you say there's a lot that we can do. What are we not aware of, and what are you saying can be done?
Perfect. So Aura, we're essentially a platform that enables individuals to get access to the nearest private emergency response vehicle using technology and connected devices. So what we see in the South African market, specifically in the security space, is it's very fragmented. Technology is not being adopted at a faster rate. So ultimately what happens is that all the processes tend to be manual, tend to be, quite aged. And so what Aura has done is essentially put every single private security and medical, for that matter, response company onto one platform, ultimately creating an automatic dispatch response to crime, eliminating the need for manual interventions, letting technology do the work, getting response times down, ultimately having the impact of getting to someone in need quickly and the positive.
Okay.
And we think, that there's quite a way to go in that space, but ultimately that's where we are making the biggest impact at this point.
Quick final question, if we're talking tech and trust, and I want to then go back to the whole issue that political narratives sometimes prevent us as South Africans to see ourselves as a community. So as crime evolves, what can we do in terms of AI-enabled analytics, geointelligence to work together as a united group to prevent crime? And their technology fails us. It's such a pity.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I got the question.
Okay, just a quick response there, Justin.
Perfect. So basically, we see technology evolving daily with the advent of AR. Where we see it going is more on your predictive policing. We've got tons and tons of data that we feed into our algorithms, that we feed into our platform, that enables our network to proactively respond to events before they actually take place, ultimately making it difficult to be a criminal in this country. And with the support of public-private partnerships as well, we see that really, really making a difference going forward, utilizing technology and ultimately utilizing a holistic approach to tackling crime.
Justin, thank you very much for that. And we do hope that those private-public partnerships actually also go into areas where the poorest of the poor are, so that it's not just a package available to the elite. Justin Sutner, General Manager at Aura Sub-Saharan Africa, we really appreciate that perspective on a very interesting discussion that is on real crime stats and political narratives and whether or not it harms us and if it can be proven true. That is just white South Africans that are being targeted. Well, that's how we end Africa World Hour this hour. Thanks for joining us. Up next, Shayla Ndukumana is with you with Hotlines. Until the next time, good night, goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your listening and viewing here.
Hotlines bring you fresh perspectives about love after dark with Shayla Ndukumana. Powerful